Okay, and we are live with another casual hangout Saturday Q&A session. Let me know how the volume is and whether or not there's any clipping or if there's any video issues, because once again, I'm just on my own here. Wow, it looks like I got a sunburn. I did a while ago. I just finished adding the LCD XC EQ in Equalizer APO, so that's what I was doing. All right. I like to add a bass shelf on that. What's up, everyone? Good to see everyone in the chat. You've been waiting on a U6T review? Nice. We have a video coming out pretty soon here on the U6T. Not really like a full review, but like some pretty good information from both Theo and myself. We both sort of collaborated on that one. Volume's fine? All right, awesome. But yeah, I figured just like last week, we'll go through, a Q&A session here. If you want to make sure that your question is answered, you can feel free to use the super chat, but don't feel like you have to. I'm going to try and go through as many questions as I can just in the live chat here. So just feel free to post your questions, and I'll just keep going down through the list. As usual, guys, we do have a giveaway going on this month, and I feel like I should probably plug that. It's not in the description of this video, but if you just want to check it out, go to headphones.com/pages/giveaways, and right now we're giving away the HD800S from Sennheiser. So if you haven't signed up yet, definitely do so, because it's a free headphone if you win. But I'm going to, without further ado, get through these the questions. And so the first one I see here is, I have an HD6XX and both HD600 and Meze Empyrean. I love them very much. Those are very, very different headphones. Oh, okay, nice to see you there. Nice. That's, it's funny. I wasn't a huge fan of the Empyrean, but I have to admit, like, the tuning there for the way that it handles the ear gain is really good. Like, still think the treble's too intense, like the upper treble, and then I think the bass is like a little bloated, but the way that it handles like the upper mid range, it's like I like ear gain. I think that's a certain amount is essential, but I also kind of find that, like, for certain recordings, I want it to be a little bit more relaxed there. And the way the Empyrean handles it is like almost ideal in my mind for, like, being versatile for my kind of preferences. But yeah, it's not one that I would personally choose. VE monks are the only headphones you'll ever need. I disagree. Yeah, I strongly disagree. Let's see, Jeff. I ordered the Rebel amp. What DAC would you pair with it? I already have a topping D90. My cans are Aria, Clear, H100S. Time for R2R DAC. Yeah, you could do that, but I mean the D90 is fine. The one thing that came out recently that was weird about the D90 is apparently when you're using MQA, none of the filters work. So it's kind of like pointless because of MQA. I remember reading something about that. But no, the D90 is a fine DAC. DACs really do not make much difference. Like, people need to understand that. Yes, amps do make a difference, but it's still not nearly the same as just going for different headphones. And DACs, especially with the off-the-shelf DACs, they really do not make much difference. Like going from the Matrix X Saber Pro to which is like over $1,000. I think it's like $2,000 or pretty close, to an SMSL SU9 to a Sonko's LAQ-XT1. Yeah, there maybe is a little difference there, but it's so tiny in comparison to just switching to different headphones. So really, I think the D90 is totally good enough. And if you just want to add some character or flavor there, then yeah, look into something that's maybe a little bit more esoteric or unconventional. Let's see. Ranking list when? Not sure. I was actually, like, I have again a a spreadsheet that I just, add a whole bunch of stuff to, not on a regular basis, but occasionally. And I've been kind of, I guess, lapsing on that a little bit just because there's been so much stuff that's coming through. So like I do need to go through and do that again. But it's not that it's not like deliberately, hidden or anything. I just don't have anywhere to publish that, on an ongoing basis. And so I think the solution is more to try and find like a sort of a platform to do that with. And maybe even just sort of like a similar kind of thing to the Tile's old Wall of Fame or something kind of like that. I don't know how useful a like fully comprehensive ranking list would be, but because Kryn already does a pretty good job with that. But yeah, I'd probably do like a something kind of like a Wall of Fame where for various different categories at different price points, I'd kind of rank my favorites. At the moment, I think the place to do that might be like the forum, like the Headphone Community Forum. So maybe I'll post it there. I also do have a measurement database coming out soon, so that should be fun. I'm working on that next week to try and integrate some of that stuff in a place that is publicly available. Have you had time to test the U6T versus the U12T, I'm assuming? I'm finally down to buying 64 audio IEM. So that's the video that is coming out soon. I might even post it tomorrow. But it's U6T. So I didn't have a U12T in at the time, but Theo, our IEM specialist, he owns one. So I collaborated with him, and he has the U6T on hand as well. So we kind of put our heads together and are giving some impressions. So that's what that video is for, and that'll be out soon. Yeah. In the guise of Rob Hawk, hello. Resolve, would you consider the Focal Radiance closed back to be worthy upgrade from the Celesti, or are they too much of the same thing? They're too much of the same thing. If you're looking for an upgrade on the Celesti, there's not really that much out there. I mean, you might want to go with a planar like this one. Maybe, man, I don't know. Maybe ZMF Verite closed, depending on the price point price bracket. But there's really not that much that is an upgrade. There's just different at that point. Anyhow, if you want more soundstage in a closed back, yeah, maybe the Verite closed would be the way to go. Are you going to review the topping EX5? Yeah, I have one here. I'm going to review it right now. My take on the EX5, and I think it's going to be the conclusion of the review, is that it's a high value unit with tons of features and lots of stuff that's got balanced outputs for the DAC, and the DAC in there is solid with the ES903 at 2QM. Similar to the Sunko's LAQXD1, which is a little less expensive, similar to the SMSL SU9, but with fewer filters and features and like sound, tone, character stuff going on. But at the same time, you get 2 amp outputs with one is single-ended. Well, they're both neither of them are balanced, but there is a XLR output for convenience on this unit. And the only thing that I don't like about it is it's like I'm gonna recommend it because I think it's actually awesome for it's very high value, but at the same time I find the amp outputs to be particularly sterile sounding. Like even just comparing the THX AAA1 from Drop against it, which the AAA1 is also kind of like a lean sounding presentation, somewhat lean. It's the topping is even more sterile than that. So what I would like, it's gonna get a recommendation, but it's not what I would buy personally. Let's see here. Is the OG HE6 better than the Aria/HE1000 SE? The HE1000 SE is more detailed than the Aria and the HE6. That thing is crazy detailed. But the HE6 I think is a better headphone. Yeah, because it's better. The overall tonality is a little better, depending on the pads that you use, and then also it slams like an absolute truck. If you want soundstage though, the Aria and HE1000 SE definitely have a bigger presentation. So it depends on what you're indexing for. Oh, you assumed it was a live testing with the U6T? That's just like a thumbnail, it's an image that I took a photo recently of it, so it's what I had on hand. Give your thoughts on either / both SH9 as an amp and the Aoun X8 with the Sindara. I can't tell you on either of those. The TT2 DAC would beg to differ. Or is that with regards to the DAC question? Yeah, so I like at the high end, this stuff does make a difference, but like you can basically look at like the majority of DACs under $1,000. They're all basically like, as long as they're good, right? Like there's some stuff out there that's really not good, but you know, you can sort of bracket that stuff away and say, okay, of the good stuff, you draw a circle around it and say, okay, is there really a huge difference among this stuff? Not huge. And then once you get into the, you know, more high end stuff, yeah, then suddenly those differences start to be a little bit more significant. But then you're paying thousands of dollars for the last element of the chain. So I think, yes, have good enough and then make the choices around headphones, less amps and DACs, and then eventually go into the, you know, switching up amps and DACs once you've settled on a certain kind of headphone sound, because you're not going to change, at least in the best cases, you're not going to change the tonal balance from solid state amplifiers, right? You're just going to, you know, affect things that draw your attention more to certain different elements of the frequency response at best. And so it's not going to be a massive difference there. You know, there's a difference between, you know, driving something properly and not driving it properly. Absolutely. But, you know, beyond that, people ask these questions about amps and DACs. It's like, it really doesn't make much difference at all, at least not compared to the differences that headphones make. Like, sure, there's a difference. I'm not going to say that there's not, but if you think about where you put your money, like, so many people run into what I would consider like a bit of a sunk cost fallacy when spending a ton of money on amps and DACs, when in reality they should just, you know, they buy a headphone and they think, oh, you know, I want to get the absolute best and most out of this headphone, and the headphone might have cost them, you know, $500, might have cost them $1,000, and then they keep buying more and more source equipment to get the most out of that headphone. When in reality, if they just spent the entire amount on a, you know, on a better headphone, they would end up with a better experience. So that's why I have a hard time really getting that into the amps and DACs, unless you're done, you know, and you're like, okay, I'm just gonna, you know, stick with this series of headphones because I love them, and then okay, now I'm gonna try and add some sort of character to it or whatever. I think that's really the thing to think about. Other than that, you're looking at the low end stuff that does have crazy value, and then that's really where those questions like what the EX5 provides comes into consideration, at least in my opinion. Thoughts on the HiFi J2? I haven't heard it. Sean, thank you. I have comfort issues wearing normal IEMs, and I'm considering custom molded IEMs from companies like 64 Audio. Do you have any recommendations under $1,500? Again, I would spend a little more and get the 64 Audio U12T and then be done with IEMs. I don't know. Do they do that in a custom? I imagine they do, because that's their whole thing. But the U12T is like the IEM to get, in my opinion. If you're going to be getting a endgame kind of flagship IEM, I'd get the 64 Audio U12T. I'd get something like the Empire Ears Odin. You know, that's like even crazy. That's like way more expensive. But like, so I personally wouldn't do that. But like the U12T, legit, I would do that. But yeah, I think I'm just wondering if there's anything under 1,500. I mean, maybe maybe the A6T if they do a custom there. Maybe that would be, you know, worth it. I can give you like a bit of a, you know, quick take on the U6T. It's somewhere in between the Neo and the U12T. Like the Neo was like super bassy, and the U6T is also like really intense, punchy bass. And the rest of it though is a little bit more similar to the U12T. A little bit more. It's not as well refined for its tonal balance, you know, for the upper mids and for the treble. But it has that same, like, if you think about what's the best multi-balanced armature IEM for bass, well, it's the U12T, and the U6T has a similar kind of strength to it. It's all about the dynamics. And then also, yeah, it does have that the TIA driver up top, so it also has that sort of smooth yet detailed treble. So that might be, yeah, I'd say U6T or whatever the custom version of that is. And then another one worth thinking about, and also I think that it's more detailed than the U6T, is the Unique Melody Mest. Whatever version of the Unique Melody Mest might be worth considering there if they do a custom there, because the nice thing about those ones is that with the bone conduction driver, I think it's sort of meant to be used that way. Rather than the just like with a certain fit there, because I found that the bone conduction driver, whatever it was, I didn't get enough presence in the mids, but it might be because of the fit. So that might kind of alleviate that issue. Will, thanks. Hi Andrew. Someone said you can forget about the Tia Forte because Tia Trio exists. Do you agree? I want to buy the Tia Forte. Is it worth it? All right. So no, I don't agree. I think they're different. They're doing different things. The thing with the Forte is that it is the most technically impressive of their lineup at the cost of being a little bit wonky there for its tonal balance. So if you're looking for a specific type of tonal character, then the Forte would be worth it. But if you're looking for a more balanced and even, presentation, that's not the one that I would go for. I would probably still gravitate more towards the U12T. The Trio is like a little more balanced, I think, than the Forte, but not as technically impressive. That's how I would kind of say where the trade-offs lie. But again, the Trio is really like that's if you want that dynamic driver. If the U12T doesn't have, it's ridiculous in the base for a multi-balanced armature IEM, but it still doesn't have quite the same kind of decay that a dynamic driver has. But between the two, or out of all of them, I would still probably go U12T. But I know a lot of people love the Trio. It's a little more V-shaped there. Let's see. Can we expect to review the Keywords Orchestra? I assume you mean the orchestra. Or will they stay more in the casual comparison video? I don't know if I'll do a review of it all on its own. If anything, I might do like an article. Because the videos take a long time to do. And there are so many of these like amazingly well-tuned IEMs that are coming out from, various different brands. Like The Audio, Kiwi Ears. I think it's actually tuned by the same person. So I think it'll be more for comparison videos if we do videos on that stuff. But because it's like otherwise that's all we would do is just let's review another awesome good value smart tuning Chi-Fi IEM. And the Kiwi Ears, I think like if you look at that segment now, for a while it was like the Duno SA6 dominated to that $500 price range. Like ever since it came out, basically I was like, all right, I wouldn't get anything else. In the last month or month and a half, we have another 4 or 5 in that segment that are or at least 4. There's the Variations, which might even be the king out of that whole price range, which I haven't heard, but Theo just published a review up on the Headphone at headphones.com website, so check that out if you're curious about the Variations review. But then there's the Kiwi Ears Orchestra, which is right at $500, and it's super detailed. I don't know, I would give it solid A's across the board for both tonal balance and technical performance. Now it's not the craziest for soundstage or anything like that. It's still a $500 IEM, but I think it is maybe even more detailed than the SA6. And then you also got the Oracle and Excalibur. The Oracle's actually the one that's probably the best there, between those two. So now, there's so many more IEMs at that price point that are legit contenders. And am I going to review each of them? Well, I don't know if I would, but I think I might do a $500 IEM kind of landscape overview comparison type thing, because they're all really good. And it's less about is this good, is it bad, and it's more about what are the differences among them, so that you could kind of make your choice that would better suit your preferences. It's kind of there's stuff that I review that you can find stuff when you're reviewing headphones that's legitimately terrible, and there's harmonic imbalances all over the place, and that stuff it's less about is it going to fit with you, and more it's just there are issues with this thing that make it sound bad. And then there's other stuff where if you like a certain genre, it might not be the best, right? I'm trying to untangle this. This is terrible. But yeah, there's, so for example, for rock and metal and stuff like that, I probably wouldn't recommend the orchestra. I'd recommend the SA6. But for jazz and classical and acoustic and stuff like that, I think this is going to be better. So that's really more what it's about, with some of these new ones that have come out that are just fantastic. Hope that answers that question. Let's see. I recently switched to omnidirectional speakers to replace my headphone collection. I never realized how much beautifully simplistic the Harman target is for speakers compared to headphones. I have no idea. What's interesting about that is that the Harman target was developed from speakers in a room with a 43AG, and I'm actually in the process of evaluating some speakers right now. The Head 00, or they had I can't remember which ones there are, but they're from Head Audio. What I'm curious to try is set them up in my studio space, and then measure them with the 43AG to see kind of how close it gets to the headphone target, because that's at the eardrum reference point, not just the microphone in the middle of the room. So I'm curious about that. And a lot of it's going to have to do with the room and the positioning and everything else, and then I'll probably do a little bit of EQ to make sure it matches with the room to get it to kind of how I want it, then cross-reference that with headphones that match that same target. So I'll be able to compare speakers directly with headphones to see how the differences manifest themselves. So that should be kind of cool. Are some frequencies have a negative effect on overall sound when applying EQ to them? For example, lowering 1K area level compared with lowering 100 hertz. That's going to depend on the headphones. So in principle, no. It doesn't really matter what you're adjusting. There's nothing that necessarily is better or worse when it comes to EQing a headphone. However, in practice, it absolutely could be better or worse, because it'll depend on how the headphone handles those regions. The other thing to keep in mind is that typically you don't, if something is super messed up in the treble, unless you have a Gross, it's really difficult, or a head and torso simulator of some kind, it's extremely difficult to actually EQ that stuff, because you have to use very fine-grained EQ and narrow Q values, and that can screw things up. So an evaluation with EQ in mind, I think typically should center around the things that you can reliably change, and the stuff that's in the treble, especially the upper treble, you can't really reliably change that. So you can add the same sort of medium Q value dips and elevations and recessions to fix the wider, bigger issues, but the more fine-grained stuff, a lot of that stuff you can't really fix, or it's extremely difficult to fix without some sort of 7-in-1 coupler or industry standard measurement rig. Currently I drive the Sundara with a topping A50S amp and the topping as a DAC. Is it worth it to upgrade to IFI Zendac V2 from topping D10S? Again, I don't think any of that stuff, as long I haven't heard the A50S, so I can't tell you, but I don't think there's any reason to go from one budget entry level DAC or DAC amp combo to another one. You're not going to notice a meaningful difference. It's worth going up to a higher end one eventually, but my recommendation is to just save your money on source equipment and buy better headphones. The Sundara is great, so maybe you don't want to buy better headphones, but that's the other thing is as long as you're powering the Sundara sufficiently, you'll be fine. It doesn't really change that dramatically. It'll change maybe a little bit, but is it worth it? You spend $500 on an amp, is it really worth it? I have a hard time with that. But actually, I would just make sure that there's enough power from that amp, because the Sundara apparently does require a decent amount of power, especially high current. Could you advise headphones that are good on large heads? Pretty much every headphone that I have a large head, so it's It's an issue. uh, I actually really like the ZMF headphones for that. They're very comfortable, and because the headband is a little bit like oh, it's back there, but the headband is like you can kind of like adjust it a little bit to fit your head better. Except the A90, right? That runs everything. I do not like the A90. There are two reasons. One is it is a flawed design because of the ground loop issue when you're using a USB DAC. And for me, it's like, why? Like, one of its core functions is just like unusable. Yes, you can, if you're running it balanced, that's not a problem, and if you're running it optical, it's not a problem. But like, how many people would commonly use a, RCA to, single-ended inputs on an amplifier and have a USB DAC, or that amplifier specifically, and have a USB DAC? I'd say that's a very common use case, and if you can't use it for that, what what are you doing? The other issue is it's very sterile and mushy sounding. I don't know how else to describe it. And the EX5 is that as well. But the thing is, at $350, that's totally acceptable, especially considering what else you get there. But at whatever the A90 comes at, let's find out how much it is. Because I think actually headphones.com sells it. Let's find out. Yeah, topping A90 is $500. At $500, I mean, comparing that directly against the Rebel amp, it was kind of almost like hilarious how much more articulate and incisive and like detailed the Rebel amp sounded over the A90. So I've kind of got a bit of a hard time with that one at $500. And that's the thing, is now that there's stuff. I mean, the only thing really that you're benefiting there with the A90 over the EX5 is balanced output plus power. But as far as like sound is concerned, like you're going from one fairly sterile sounding amp to another one. So I don't really see the benefit of the A90. And I mean, that's a soapbox that I've been on for a while. I think actually from the balanced output of the A90 with certain planar magnetic headphones, it's not so bad. It was really more, I noticed it from the single-ended output with dynamic driver headphones. That's where I really noticed the difference between the A90 and the Rebel amp. And it was like volume matched at this with SPL calibrated and everything, and I wasn't actually even like alone when I was testing this. Like I think actually Taryn was there as well in the office, and I like switched to the other one. I was like, oh my god. This is crazy. And he'd done the same test as well and found the same thing. So I think a lot of that probably comes down to what you're trying to do. If you're trying to make your stuff sound like, if you have the opinion that amplifiers should do literally nothing but make it louder, then something like the A90 is probably okay. I mean, I'd even say it almost like, I don't know if it takes anything away, but when you compare it to things that do something that make it more engaging and dynamic, it's very obvious which sort of, I guess, philosophy or approach is preferable, because it just sounds better. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if the Rebel amp doesn't measure as well, but do I care? I mean, I care from it's interesting standpoint, but beyond that, no. I do want to try the Unique Melody Mess Mark II. I haven't had a chance to try that one yet, but that I'm very interested because the first one was quite detailed. Is iFi Black Label an upgrade when compared to something like the DX160? Oh, hey, Corinne's here. What's up, Corinne? I don't know if I'd call it an upgrade. I mean, it's an upgrade in the sense that it's got more power and it's really quite versatile. But again, it's the same thing. Like, spend that money on headphones, and only when you're done, then put it into different source equipment. If the DX160, what I didn't like about, the DX160 is great, but what I didn't like about it is that I couldn't charge it and use it as a DAC at the same time when plugged into a computer. So it really was more like you could use it as a DAC, but you have to switch it into DAC mode, and then it's plugged in with the cable for the DAC mode, and there's no charging, so you got to charge it first. and I couldn't just like leave it on. Whereas with the micro black label, there's no issues there. Just get an AB1266 and a shit Magni. You know what's funny is that the Magnius could run it. I imagine. I haven't tried it, but Mest is nowhere near U12T. I mean, yeah, I would take the U12T over the Mest, but at 1500 or like I don't know, 1300 or whatever it's at, I think it's pretty darn detailed. Remember, kids, the best closeback headphones are IEMs. Disagree. I think there are things that, yeah, I mean, there's certainly IEMs that I would take over most closeback headphones. But again, I mean, I have to hear the IE900 because I think that's like the only one that's close to this. But like, show me a dynamic driver IEM that has the same kind of frequency response and tuning as something like a Celesti or Radiance. So far, dynamic and same technical performance at the same price. I so far haven't come across that. Same thing with this planar. Show me a planar closeback IEM that has the same tuning as this. I don't think you can. Like, the closest would have been the Euclid, and it's not close. Like, so this is where Crin and I differ. I mean, if you're just gonna say all, like, you can pick any IEM. Sure. I mean, yeah. I mean, the U12T. All right. I would take the U12T over most closebacks. Yeah. But if you're doing more of an apples to apples comparison with like driver type and like price point, I don't see it. Let's see. Do you have a recommendation for the best pair of cans for classical and jazz for a budget of 1,000? Best for classical and jazz. Yeah, the Ananda is pretty good for that. I assume you mean like open back headphones. It depends. Like if you're looking for IEMs, yeah, I mean, I like that Kiwi Ears Orchestra. It's not expensive for those genres. You know, it's funny. Like I know, like Theo really likes the S8. For like technical performance, it is detailed, but I don't. I can't handle the tuning. It's too like upper mid forward and shouty for me. And that's what I like about the Kiwi Ears Orchestra is that it's just a little more relaxed there. And if you're talking closeback headphones, classical and jazz, yeah, I mean maybe Celesti or the Aeon 2 Noir with the perforated pads. You gotta use the perforated pads. Maybe that would be okay. Does the 2020 Utopia headband still creak? I think it actually creaks because of the carbon fiber that they use for the arms. I think that's the reason for that. I know I've missed a few, but I have to kind of like, oh, what's up, Precogs in the chat? I missed a few, so you know, if I missed your question, just feel free to ask it again. I'll try and get to it. Hey, Resolve. I bought myself the Monarchs on your recommendation. What is next for soundstage and imaging improvement without losing all the lovely tuning of in these? Yeah, maybe the Mest actually. That's another example of the Mest. I mean, and to a certain extent, the Andromeda has pretty cool like soundstage and imaging, but yeah, I don't know. I'm not a fan of the Andromeda's bass, so yeah, maybe the Mest. Some people like the Andromeda bass though. It's probably just a me thing. I don't know. Let's see what's next here. If you had the U12T and the Mest Mark II already, would you? I haven't heard that one, but would you still go for the Odin, or would you call IEM Endgame right now? The Odin is a different enough character to both of those. Like the Odin is the one that's more like close to neutral, I guess I would say. Although I can't tell you about the Mest Mark II. I really I need to get that one in. But the U12T is more of a relaxed kind of sound with a little bit more, yeah, like, I don't know. I hesitate to say warm because it's not really, because it has that sort of upper treble as well. But if you're talking like strictly the ear gain region, in a certain extent, or to a certain extent, I think actually the Odin is a little bit more even, let's say. It looks a little odd on the frequency response graph because it's like there's a bit of distance there between the upper mids and lower mids. And just like the way, like the shape of the rise is almost like a little bit like bulging on the graph. But this just means that it's a little bit more like there's a hint of that sort of forwardness there, that I notice with vocals a little bit. Like somewhere, I want to say like somewhere around like 1.52K. But yeah, it's a different enough character from both of those. Now, should you buy an Odin? I think it's like, I would never spend that kind of money on an IEM personally, because that's like, you know, way outside my price range. And yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, if you like, I probably would just stay at the U12T and call it a day. Oh yeah, I need to try that Anole VX thing. I know Precog. I think he listened to it. But yeah, I know that's pretty high on Crin's list too. I gotta check that out. JT, thank you. Just acquired a set of Sesvaras on the used market. Any amp recommendations to properly drive them under 2.5K? Is the IFI Pro ICANN sufficient? Yeah, that's definitely enough. I mean, do you have one? Because, yeah, I mean, you'll easily have enough power there. That's no, like, that thing has what, like, over 10 watts or something? I don't know. How much power does that? Pro ICANN. I feel like it was like 14 watts or something ridiculous and balanced. I can't find it right now. Output power. Yeah, 14 watts. That's got to be at 16 ohms. Anyways, it's stupid powerful. So yeah, you can drive it sufficiently with that. I haven't personally tried that combo. You know, I think this is one of those questions where you might want to do a little bit more research on like what the, because you want something that's like high current, specifically, and to a certain extent, I'd almost like look at like one of those amps that's like specifically designed around this Sesvara, because there are a few, like there's the IHA6 at a much lower price tag. There are things that the Pro ICANN does better, but it's not as specialized, right? It's a little bit more versatile. So to a certain extent, the IHA6 would be another good choice there because of the high current mode. But yeah, other than that, I'm not really sure what else is around the 2.5K price range. Maybe check out some of the Burson stuff that people are talking about. Again, I haven't tried that, but a lot of people are on the forum are talking about the Burson stuff. Rob, thank you. I can't wrap my brain around cleaner bass than the Monarchs. Oh, they're just like very, very elevated, and the sub bass is just like really strong bass. So some people think of clean bass as like more kind of like linear like bass, but in my opinion, like neutral bass actually does require a boost. Like it requires an elevation there to sound normal, like compared to over your headphones. There's something weird as well going on with the way that the sub 11 couplers, when you take the pinna off, there's something weird about the way that represents the bass, and I need to read more about that. But I so far am also like inclined, like I had a big long conversation with Jude about the 5128 at one point about this, and or this came up, and I think he's right about the 5128 being more accurate for IEMs in the bass than the 711, like when you're using the ear sim. Alex, thank you. Do you think headphones in general have reached their apex in terms of efficiency and performance? Please advise. Depends what you mean by efficiency, because like, efficacy. Sorry, I read that wrong. No. And the reason why is because if you look at like the ultra high end stuff, like the Sesvara, Abyss AB1266, the LCD4, you know, to a certain extent the D8000 Pro, which is somewhere over there, to a certain extent the HE1000 SE, a Diana Phi. What else? The Stax SR007 and SR009. Hi-Fi Man, Shangri-La Jr. Like, I'm just listing off ridiculously expensive stuff here, but to a certain extent, that stuff has probably achieved the pinnacle of, the technical aspects in various different ways. HE6 as another one there for Slam. In various ways, I think they've probably achieved, what's possible there from a technical standpoint. But what hasn't been achieved, apart from one example, and you guys know which one that is that level of technical performance with a tonal balance that makes things sound normal and good. Like, it sounds natural. And the Susvara, again, is the only one that's there for that. Like, I still like add a bass shelf to it, but and I fill in that sort of like 1.5K kind of dip area, but it's very slight. But those are the ones that sound tonally, like the Susvara sounds way more tonally correct than an LCD4 or an AB1266 or a HE1000 SE or a Diana Phi. They sound the way that those reference points sound in real life. And so, maybe and you can even throw the HE100S in there because it does soundstage like so, crazy wide. If you think about like every different headphone that does a particular thing extremely well, like you might say, oh, the HE6 Slam is really hard. The Abyss has the crazy, and the LCD4 have crazy good detail. The HE100S has we're talking about soundstage. Like all of those different like best at a thing headphones still are not. They don't combine that with the kind of tonal balance presentation that something like a Susvara has, and Focal Utopia, right, is another one. Really good macro contrast there. That's why, like, in my mind, like the best sounding headphones in the world right now are the Susvara and the Utopia, and these ones that combine the this crazy technical stuff with really good tonal balance, because I think at that level, I mean, to a certain extent, like I think manufacturers probably they're not as meticulous about the tuning as they are about trying to get these other aspects. But when you know what stuff is supposed to sound like, as in the sense of like, not in an elitist sense, but like in a sense of like you have those reference points in real life, then you realize that like a lot of this stuff is just like, it's more being engineered for what's possible, not necessarily what's correct. And I think once those two kind of like meet, then we have reached the pinnacle of performance. And so far there are a few examples, but very few examples of that. But yeah, so I still think there's a ways to go there. What's next? I'm going to just go back here because I missed a few. When is the HE100S giveaway? Well, we're doing it at the end of the month. I know it's on a Saturday, so I'll try and schedule it in advance so we know. So it might be Friday, it might be Saturday, but yeah, it'll be one of those 2 days. What do you think are the best DAC amps for use with IEMs only? I mean, to a certain extent, the Micro Black Label's good, but I didn't really like the IE match thing. But what's good about it is that it does have the different modes. Another one I actually, I was surprised. I liked the Rebel amp for IEMs because it has low gain. Like it's there's no noise floor on low gain with it. The other one that's actually surprisingly good at a much more modest price is the THX AAA1. Now, it's not the best amplifier, but it's one of the more versatile ones, because it's got the low gain again for IEMs, and you get 3 gain stages, but the third one is good for like the more demanding headphones. And the high end, something like the Pro iCan is pretty good because it also is quite versatile. I haven't tried it with IEMs, but I do know that it has multiple different gain settings there. So and I think they're all pretty low output impedance as well, so they're not going to massively change things with something like an Andromeda. So I would say the Rebel amp, the AAA1, but that's for both headphones and IEMs. For just IEMs, I don't know, like I maybe a DAP or something like that. Um, I guess it's more like you just need an output than anything else. So you can get away with, not spending all that much money. Just get like a DAC amp combo or something like that. Let's see. If you have focal clear, I don't. I mean, yeah, the 6XX are different, but the focal clear is way better at most things. It's not as smooth in the treble. That's the one area where the 6XX is better. It's worth having as a reference point, though. HD 560S recommended EQ profile. It's not one that I really bother EQing. I drop maybe like 4 to 5K a bit because it's a bit hot there, but apart from that, pretty solid tuning. Actually, this is the thing. Like, I see a lot of people, they ask for like EQ profiles on headphones like the Sundara or 560S, and it's like you don't really need to do anything with those headphones. Like at that point, you're not fixing anything major. You're just changing it to match your preference because they're already really well balanced. And so with that, if that is the case, like you don't need an EQ profile. Just look at the frequency response and adjust it where you think, like listen to it. Listen to it and look at the frequency response. Say, okay, well, maybe I want less upper mids, or maybe I want more bass, or maybe I want, less lower treble. Like, just look at it that way. Don't rely on a profile. Let's see. I haven't heard the DX300, so I don't know if that's a worthwhile upgrade. I haven't heard that. Is that a Sony? The NWZ507? But I know that Theo really likes the DX300. So my go-to one is the DX220, which is really nice, actually. That's a little on the large side. What are the best ANC headphones for blocking the noise from birds fighting outside your window, stray dogs fighting outside your window, or your next door neighbors fighting outside your window? What's funny is, I think the Sony XM4 WH1000 XM4s and AirPods Max so far are the best at that. But yesterday I was at the studio and I was working away, and for whatever reason, like someone's car alarm just kept going off like for hours on end. This is the downside with working downtown. And it was just like, man, this is, if I worked downtown like all the time and it was like that all the time, that would be so frustrating. And people's car alarms, birds fighting outside. We get seagulls down there as well. So yeah, we gotta like, I don't know, set up the studio so it's like soundproofed or something. Josh Velour rates the A90 as one of the best in terms of price. Yeah, I just disagree. Like, I like Josh a lot, but like, and same with DMS, right? Reviewers can disagree. They can have different opinions and stuff. It's encouraging. What's encouraging for me is because I try not to like have my impressions too affected by what other people say about stuff, because narratives can form. I should do a video about this, but like narratives around products can have such a massive influence on how we how we perceive them psychoacoustically. And so if you have a bunch of framing effects that, oh, this is supposed to be better than X, because somebody said it's better than X or at a certain quality, you're going to be more likely to pay attention to those things. So it's really difficult to evaluate this stuff after you've read somebody else's review or somebody's. I mean, to a certain extent, like it's difficult even to evaluate it knowing what the price is, because there's so many different framing effects that kind of influence the way that you pay attention to things. And so it's almost better to like first evaluate price agnostic and just not look at that, or price ignorant, and not pay attention to anybody else's reviews. But what I find encouraging is after I review something, I'll ask somebody else who's heard it, somebody else who like I really trust, like like Android, for example, or metal. And when or when it comes to IEMs, it's Theo generally. And when somebody else's that person's impressions line up with my own or are kind of close, it's encouraging to know that okay, we're speaking the same language, and so that's great, I think. But at the same time, to a certain extent, we're all kind of like constrained by the metaphors that we use. And if I'm constantly, using the same people as sort of like the sanity check for myself, then we're bound to speak the same language. So somebody like Josh or DMS or somebody who I don't regularly, bounce impressions off of, might have a different framing of metaphors for how they're for their experiences. And that's sort of, I guess, the downside, one of the major downsides to the subjective aspects of this stuff, because people have a different language, like different terms that they're using to describe their experiences. Not necessarily that they're having different experiences, it's just that those experiences are potentially characterized differently, and then that influences, again, the narrative. And then the other aspect is when I say that something is limited for the trailing ends of tones, that has an impediment to detail to me, someone else might go, that just sounds fast to me. Like, it just sounds like, I might say, oh, that's blunted, or something, to use Crin's term. But then somebody else might go, oh, that I like that quality. So these are all really just acoustic properties and acoustic qualities that we're paying attention to and keying in on in different ways. And because we have different ways of analyzing this stuff, we're going to end up with different results. So it's both frustrating but also interesting. For planar magnetic headphones, you always suggest high current amplifiers, but how do you know if it's high current? From which number is it sufficient? That's a really good question. I only know it from sometimes you see the specs posted in various different places, but this IHA6 here specifically has a high current button on it. So there are two different current modes there. So yeah, I think a lot of that is just like, again, I do know from just like reading certain spec sheets, but actually it's worth mentioning this. I have a particular bee in my bonnet when it comes to amp manufacturers publishing different like specs that are not consistent with the way that everybody else is publishing them, and so that happens a lot. And because of that, it can be very difficult to get an answer to that question. But so another way that I've learned about this is just talking to the amplifier manufacturers. So and they say, oh yeah, no, this, like, we designed this specifically around having high current or whatever. And like, so for example, Justin from Amps and Sound was telling me that about the way that they developed some of their amplifiers. It was specifically designed to have high current. So that's an indication, I guess. So yeah, I think it's a worthwhile question to ask. How do you predict that? And I don't know if this is one of the reasons why I want to get like one of those like audio precisions, to be able to actually tell on a reliable basis, to just get a whole bunch more data from the amplifiers. Let's see what's next here. Burst and Soloist is a nice amp, pricey but still nice sounding. Man, it's hot in here. It's because I put the light on. Almost had a hybrid tube amp flavor going on sometimes. Yeah, people like that one. That one keeps cropping up. So I'll need to check that out. Can you go over exactly how you run your FLAC music? I don't. Well, I use Amazon HD right now. I'm just evaluating, different stuff, and that is technically, I guess, it's streaming FLAC. So, but I don't use offline FLAC files anymore. Let's see. Are there any IEM tip brands well known for their comfort, like Deconi? I like Deconi for that stuff. Deconi's actually, with their tips, they're some of the best ones for me, at least, because when I'm walking outside, I prefer the foam ones just because I don't like the pressure that happens from the silicone ones. But then, at the same time, I do acknowledge that the silicone ones do typically sound better. Not the final E's necessarily, but just like the regular, like, I don't know, stuff like this. If you could see that. You guys are talking. There's so much discussion about amps and DACs. It's like, get into headphones. Let's see. What else? I'm trying to find something here that's like gonna be a longer discussion. Well, you guys are asking about the giveaways in international, whether they're open to international viewers. So this latest one is, but the bigger issue, the issue isn't so. I mean, shipping, yes, that's one issue, but more significant than that, it's worth Googling if you're curious about this. There are regions in the world where you simply are not legally allowed to do giveaways, for starters, and so we have to exclude those regions. There are other regions, and it has to do, I think, partially with like data protection and privacy and stuff like that. Another issue is there are certain places where there are very stringent requirements that there's no way anybody would be able to fulfill. Like there's one where it's like you have to go to the country to deliver the goods physically and be in the presence of like an official from that country. So it's like there's no way we would ever be able to do that, to be able to comply with whatever legal reasons or legal requirements. So that's why we had to limit them. But oftentimes those things kick in only at a certain price. So for lower price stuff, it's typically not as like the whatever the requirements there. They're like, oh, over $5,000 or over $4,000 or something like that. Then it needs to comply with these rules. And that's why that's the bigger issue than the shipping issue, even though that's also an issue. But then also I mean we're working with software that tries to get around some of that, at least ideally, because as long as you kind of like indicate what the legal restrictions are, or like which countries are eligible, then it's fine to do international. But it just means that if you're from one of those countries where it's like just not legal to do a giveaway, then unfortunately we can't do it. Do headphone reviewers get any vacations? I don't think that I've taken vacation in the last like couple of years, but that's also because where would I have gone? I think the only thing I don't really take vacations, but I'd like to, like, what I want to do more of is I want to go travel more places with headphones and IEMs and stuff like that, and then talk a little bit about the experience of using this stuff, like for example with IEMs and DAPs and things like that. If I go somewhere and I'm going to review something, it would make sense to review that. And in that sense, I like something more portable. And in that sense, I'd almost want to like use that as an opportunity to do the portable kind of stuff, because otherwise, what am I doing? It's not a real use case if I'm just like sitting in a studio or sitting at home listening to this stuff. I mean, yes, technically you can evaluate that stuff. I'm not saying you can't by doing that, but A, it's kind of boring, and B, you might as well take it, like you might as well use it the way that other people would use it as well. So because that's like an additional element there, like the usability, I guess. It's more significant for like true wireless stuff, and I've been actually spending a lot of time with the WF-1000 XM4s, which are very good actually, but the problem with them is the fit is kind of not that great, at least for me. Let's keep going here. So I'm driving the Sindara off a topping E30 L30 stack. Should I look to get a more powerful amp or look into that if and when I upgrade the Sindaras. Yeah, you're fine there. Just make sure that just check the serial number on the L30s and make sure it's not one of the ones that explodes. They're like, this is obviously like a really big issue. Like if an amplifier explodes or blows up headphones and stuff like that, because there was that issue on a number of them, then that's really bad. That should never happen. So, and I know they said, okay, these ones had the issue after this serial number. You're fine. So double check that. But yeah, I mean, as far as the amp's functions, yeah, that's fine. They do get vacations, but they keep reviewing headphones anyways. Yeah, exactly, right? I mean, I'd love to be able to, go to Europe and review headphones from there, like write articles and do that kind of stuff, or go, I don't know, just somewhere that's not just here, as much as I like, where I live, I'd like to be able to, like not that long ago, about a week ago, I went to the interior for the weekend, and on the way back, I drove up a mountain, and it was just amazing. I posted some pictures to Twitter actually, and I was thinking, if I could like review headphones up here, that would be awesome. Problem with Hi-Fi Man headphones, I own 3, is that they are technically brilliant but cosmetically crappy in my opinion. Consequently, they are somewhat overpriced from that perspective. Cosmetically, I actually really like the way the Sindara looks. But yeah, I'd agree. I'm not a fan of the rest of the aesthetics that they go for. The HE6 and the HE500 were great looking. The Sindara is great looking. I mean, for what I like, the Susvara would be great looking if not for the wood thing that they have in it. I don't like the wood. The Shangri-La Junior is a great looking headphone, I think. But yeah. I'm not a fan of the way that the egg-shaped ones look. And I was recently evaluating a 560, which is also, that's a fantastic headphone. I hadn't, the tuning's not as good as the Sindara, just straight up. It's not as good. It's too much distance between the upper mids and mids, like around 2K. Maybe you could fix that by swapping out the Sindara 2020 pads and putting it on there, and then it'd be better. But man, it's detailed. Like I'd say, maybe even slightly more detailed than the Sindara. So really quite nice. Just do what Zeos does. Wait until you sit down to do the review to look up any information on the product. Oh god. All YouTube reviewers have their own take and taste, undeniable. The problem is when they portray their opinion as objective. Well, when you're measuring stuff, at least you have objectivity. Like you have data to be like, again, you have to be very careful about this because some objective stuff matters and some of it doesn't. Like the amp and DAC objective stuff really doesn't matter. I mentioned this in the last live stream. It really doesn't matter past a certain point. I think what happens there when people get really excited about that, like for example the A90, it measures really well, right? And obviously, like, it's the differences between that on the index that people saw, where it ranks really highly. Everything in that list is gonna sound like it's way beyond the threshold of hearing, right? You won't actually hear any of those differences. But I think what people think is that if I get the thing that is like so much more like, better on this particular index, even if it's beyond the threshold of human hearing, at the very least I could be confident in that thing. It's the same reason that people would use, 24-bit FLAC files, because even if, they couldn't, in a blind test, they wouldn't be able to hear the difference between that and 320. I'm not saying there isn't a difference, but like imagine, for example, in a blind test, you couldn't hear the difference. That they would still want to use the FLAC files because at the very least, they could be confident that they were getting the best, format, that they were getting lossless. And that made a difference, that inspired confidence. I think that's the reason people gravitate to the measured, DAC amp stuff. But in my opinion, that stuff's not really like, if you can't hear the difference in a blind test, like in those cases, again, that's why I say put more of your money into headphones. And really, like, I would, between the topping A90 and this, there's really not much reason to get the A90 other than the balanced output and more power. So because it has very similar sound, basically the same kind of sound. Did I miss any of the super chats? I don't think so. JE Cans, thank you. Which Odyssey below the LCD4, too much money, would you recommend? I haven't tried the LCD3 with the new pads. I recommend the LCD2F, the LCD-X, the XC. But again, like, if you're gonna get an Aussie, you might as well also get into EQ because they can handle EQ. The ones I don't recommend are the LCD2 Classic. I don't, because it's just not really that competitive for the technical performance. You might as well get an LCD2F. It's more detailed. I haven't heard the MX4 or the 4Z either. So I'd be curious about those. The GX is also decent, but also not on the level of the LCD2F. So yeah, I'd say LCD2F X XC. LCD2F is like, I don't know. That one is, it's funny because it's close enough in price to the LCD-X, but I find the LCD2F to be a little more comfortable, and it's not that far away as far as, like, you know, performance is concerned. So, but both are good. Let's see. How do you respond to the claim that technical performance doesn't exist? So the technical performance is just a term that audiophiles, myself included, or reviewers, like me or Kryn, or I guess a number of us, use to indicate things that are not immediately available in tonal balance and frequency response. Now, we don't. That's not to say that it's not necessarily captured by existing metrics like frequency response or even THD. But it's just not analyzed in terms of these things, and so these are subjective qualities. They're reported subjectively, and so it's things that, you know. I like to think there's actually a certain amount of agreement there among people who, again, know what stuff is supposed to sound like for these qualities. And again, when I kind of back up and zoom out on this, I acknowledge that you have to acknowledge that these are just acoustic properties that we've then put labels onto. And that's kind of like, it's kind of like not authentic. It's not an authentic description of the acoustic property necessarily. But it is an authentic description of the experience that you get when you hear that, or when your attention is drawn to that acoustic property. So when we're talking about the sense of openness, or, you know, width or depth or something like that, or, you know, we talk about the clarity for trailing ends of tones, you know, the immediacy of the leading edge, all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's stuff that actually is going on acoustically. There are acoustic properties that are occurring in the headphone that we're then just describing in this way. So it doesn't exist insofar as it's, you know, like the detail is not a thing that exists in a headphone, right? Same thing with, you know, the soundstage, for example. You know, dynamics, that's not a thing that exists in a headphone, or like what we call macro contrast or macro dynamics or something like that. That's a subjective quality that is attached to an acoustic property that actually does exist. And what that acoustic property is, I mean, that's really why this stuff is still so, it's one of the, you know, big mysteries, I think, about all this stuff. Like, and for those people who say frequency response is everything, my answer is like, yeah, maybe it's there in frequency response, but nobody is analyzing frequency response in terms of those things. We're only just analyzing it in terms of tonal balance. And so you can't look at a frequency response graph and say, this is going to be more subjectively interesting for these acoustic properties that you've identified. And then this is, again, where the limit is metaphor and language that we're using sort of to describe these things. Um, but what I find so interesting is that there's a lot of agreement among, again, trusted reviewers. I say trusted here, like there's a lot of, just say reviewers who aren't just like, doing clickbait stuff. Like, you know what I mean? Like I can talk to, Metal 571, I can talk to Kryn, I can talk to Antdroid, I can talk to DMS, and we can generally agree on, I can talk to Theo, we can generally agree on, these qualities. There's some places where we disagree, but for the most part, I tend to think that there's a certain amount of agreement there, and that to me indicates that, like, I mean, yes, we are speaking the same language, but then also that there is something there. There's a there, and so whether it's a matter of just analyzing frequency response in terms of these things, or if it's a matter of trying to find some other way to capture it and then predict it, that's important. I think one of the reasons why people question that they say things like, oh, technical performance doesn't exist, it's just all subjective placebo and stuff, and the only thing that's there is frequency response. The reason why people have these or express that opinion is because they haven't heard this stuff. That's like, if you look at, like, I saw a while ago, someone was like, oh yeah, the HE400 SE, that's basically the same frequency response as an HE6 or Susvara or whatever, so it sounds as good as those two. And it's like, that person, I guarantee you, hasn't heard those other two headphones. I guarantee it. And so there's a lot of, like, you want to do sort of, like, I guess, armchair analysis, which I understand why. It's like you want to be able to get the most for your money, and that's a thing that indicates a kind of similarity. It's visually compelling, but you can't make an HE400 SE sound like a Susvara. I'm sorry, it's never going to. And with EQ or whatever else, right? It's just never going to. So really, a lot of what gets expressed there is from people who haven't heard these things. Let's see. What the heck? Become the druid of the headphones? What? Somewhere in the mountains of Canada, there's Resolve reviewing headphones with the wind and the birds. Yes, I love that idea. Did double check the serial number on my L30. Thankfully, it's the 2012 series. The non-exploding ones. That's awesome. I support non-exploding L30s. I wonder if I should buy another IEM, IE900 maybe, or upgrade DAP. Current setup is U12T plus DX160. Like, that's, to me, that's all I would ever, if I were to actually buy, high-end IEMs and a DAP, I would do exactly that. Or I'd get like a DX220 or DX300. But the nice thing about the DX160 is that it's smaller and more pocketable. So yeah, the DX160 is solid there. Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard the IE900, but it might, if you are going to get another IEM, it might be worth getting something that is a different driver type. Like, it might be worth getting something with a dynamic driver in it, like that one. Michael, thanks. Not question, just thank you. Keep it up. Oh, you're very welcome. What is detail? Yeah, so I really liked Kryn's article on the tonal technical dichotomy. And it basically, he kind of explained how he evaluates stuff with these two ideas in mind. One is the objective, data-driven stuff, and I evaluate stuff exactly the same way. I think that's sort of like something you have to do because, this is, these two avenues. There's something real there. Like, obviously, with the objective stuff and the tonal balance stuff, that's obviously real. But for the same reason that, like, what I just talked about, no matter what you do with EQ to an HE400 SE, it'll never sound like a Susvara. And you can have stuff that has totally bonkers frequency response, like an HE1000 SE or an older LCD4, to a certain extent a 2020 LCD-X, the older one. And they have still this ridiculous technical performance there. An HE6, people used to say, like, what reviewers call technical performance. People used to say that, that association with quote-unquote detail that's just because the upper treble frequencies are boosted. But then you look at an HE6, not really, and that thing is probably the most detailed headphone I've heard under $2,000. Maybe even more than that. Like it's extremely detailed, and it's not at all boosted in the upper treble because that headphone's driver is, I believe it's PET, and it's a little bit thicker than the nanoscale stuff that they're doing now, which does boost the treble in the it's more upper treble because it's thinner, so there's less moving mass. But on the HE6, it's a little bit like it's still thin, but it's a little thicker than those newer ones. And that one, it's designed much more for a extremely low resonance frequency, and so you don't have that super upper tilted like 12K and above stuff. Like it's balanced there, it's fine, but it's not like an LCD4 in that region, or like a HE1000 SE. So it's not associated with any of those. It's not like that is the reason why we perceive this stuff. Like maybe the music, tokens these upper harmonics that then are elevated, and that is the perception of details. It's not about that at all, because I've seen a lot of like objectivists kind of make that argument, and there's enough counter examples there, even with like warm or dark headphones too, that kind of invalidate that a little bit. But then also you hear stuff that has like crazy upper treble that is not detailed at all, and really I think when it comes to detail, this is why again I'm going back to Corinne's article there. The way I see it is it's a balance between the speed and the immediacy of the initial leading edge and the length of the decay, for microdynamics and small gradations of volume and clarity for trailing ends of tones on the decay. And also, I think baked into that to a certain degree is the control during busy passages and separation and incisiveness. To me, those are the elements that contribute most to detail. Now, some people are only going to look at speed. They're going to, I think Corinne is like this as well. He thinks speed is what we think of as detail. It's just to do with the way that the immediacy of the initial leading edge is handled, and then the clarity for trailing ends of tones. I think there's a little bit more to it than just that. And some people will also kind of like parse it in terms of both micro detail and micro detail, microdynamics. I kind of like to, rope it a little bit more all into one, because I don't think, like, for example, I might listen to the harmonic done Zeus is a good example of this. It was quite detailed for certain aspects of that, but not as detailed as like a Sundara for separation and control, which actually made it lose a little bit of clarity overall. So, but again, all we have here are these subjective terms. Those things are not things that exist in those ways in headphones. There are acoustic properties that we then like perceive in this way, that we then express in this way. And so I think the big question is going to be moving forward, and this is something that I'm trying to do, is identify what those acoustic properties are so that we'd be able to predict that, whether it's by using frequency response and THD or existing metrics, or by some other, non-existing thing. And again, people talk about like CSD and stuff like that here, and it really like that stuff. It's just another way of looking at frequency response. Now, I'm of the opinion with that stuff that it's okay to look at frequency response in a different way, as long as you know that that's what you're doing. And if it's easier to read certain things, then I'm fine with using it. I don't want to publish that stuff because I don't want people to get the wrong idea necessarily. So that's really what's going on there. But the question of what is detail, I mean, at the moment, all we really have is metaphors and subjective analysis and subjective terms. And I see Metal 571's in the chat. So to use his analogy, it's like when you look through a window, the window could be very clear or it could be very opaque, or like translucent. And like how clear the window is, it's going to show you the more details there are going to be in the scene that you're looking at. Whereas if it's a little bit more translucent or opaque, the details aren't going to be as clear. I like to use the analogy as well of it's the sharpness of the lens. It's not the resolution of the image, it's the sharpness of the lens. That's how I see detail. And if you think about it in photography terms, in camera terms, those things are also analyzed in terms of micro contrast as well. And so, I mean, to me, to use those visual analogies, I mean, they're not the same. They are analogies, but I think they do kind of work as far as the experience is concerned. Any chance we can convince IEM manufacturers to reduce the accessories and cases, leave that stuff out, and cut the cost? I have like 5 cases, 470 tips I never use. Oh man, I doubt it, because it's one of the things, like, that stuff doesn't cost very much, so there's like no reason not to include it. And then there's a lot of perceived value that gets generated because there's all this stuff that gets included. So you spend $500 on a thing that produces sound, and what if you just get that thing? Well, there's a pretty big difference between that and getting that thing plus all these different little accessories and things like that. You probably feel a little bit better about that, even if the thing that didn't have all the accessories technically sounded better. Like, I'm with you. I agree. Like, I'm the kind of person who would be more interested in the thing that sounds good, but that perceived value question, I think, is the reason why a lot of that stuff gets included. I really like what The Audio does with the it's not just The Audio, but what they do with, I don't have it here, but their cables, sorry about that, their cables are these 2.5 millimeter here, balanced, and then they give you a whole bunch of adapters, so you can run it with whatever source you have. Let's see. Darko Audio is basically everything wrong with this hobby. So I obviously am doing a totally different thing from what Darko's doing. In fact, what we're all doing on this channel is a very different thing. But I don't think he's actually reviewing anything. I don't think he intends to review anything. I think he's just making videos that are more just like, let's talk about what it's like to be an audiophile. But what I will say is he's produced some of the most hilarious videos I've ever seen. His April Fool's one this year was amazing, and everybody should watch that. Because I don't think he takes himself too seriously, which I definitely appreciate. But yeah, very, very obviously what he's doing is very different from what I'm doing. Steve Guttenberg is doing something entirely different, and I fundamentally disagree with things that both of them have said. If Steve recently said something about how measurements don't matter and you should never base your purchase decision on measurements, I'm like, well, that's wrong, because there's a pragmatic reason to care about measurements, especially when it comes to like frequency response measurements. I think he was talking more about like DACs and amps, but still, the big reason is it keeps manufacturers honest. So that you can't just sell people bad sounding stuff because your marketing tactics work, whatever you put on the box. And with measurements, like what we're doing with the Gross, what Kren's doing also with the Gross, there's a few other people who are measuring headphones with these 711 couplers, and publishing the data is in many ways making sure that we have these reference points that make it so that you can't just have the wool pulled over your eyes, right? By marketing language. And there's a lot of brands that have actually, they've used this to their benefit. They've really been like, this is actually helpful information for us, and it allows us to iterate and improve things. There are other brands who see this stuff as, oh, they're just, they don't know what they're doing, they don't know what they're talking about, and we know best. In reality, though, they don't. This is a bit of a, I really think it's a bit of like a sink or swim scenario that's kind of hitting us. The more people have these measurement rigs, and the more people understand measurements, so there is a pragmatic element to this, in the sense that you are more likely to be able to buy something that is going to sound good when manufacturers are paying attention to measurements, because people are paying attention to measurements, than if measurements didn't exist, than if nobody were paying attention to this stuff. Because then what are you left with? You're left with someone's subjective impressions, who may or may not know what stuff is supposed to sound like, and whatever they put on the box. So this is why I like to tell manufacturers, publish your measurements, because manufacturers, when they are doing measurements themselves, you might as well publish that stuff, because reviewers are going to do it anyways. And thankfully some manufacturers do now. I've noticed this more with IEM stuff. But if you think about again, all the amazing sounding IEMs that have come out from the Chi-Fi scene, that I think is a direct result of manufacturers paying a little bit more close attention to measurements. and how things should sound. And in some ways, it's a testament to Crin's list. I know he did it on the 0045 coupler initially, but even with that, like, that's going to give you an indicator of what preferred sound qualities. He's just one person, sure, but would you rather have some sort of reference point that you can anchor expectations to, or would you rather just like kind of shotgun approach to the wind, and over time you have standout legendary headphones like a HD600 or whatever that just sort of stands the test of time, where everything else just sort of falls away? Well, I'd rather have everything be great, and not all the same target, but everything be great in the sense that there was some intention behind the tuning of the headphone, rather than just like putting stuff into a housing and being like, audiophile, go. So for that reason, I think what Steve Guttenberg has said is wrong. But to get back to that question about Darko and those guys, they're just doing something that's entirely different. And if you're interested in that stuff, I would say go ahead. I got nothing against those guys. Even if I think they're wrong about certain things, like what they're producing, that's gonna speak to a certain type of person that maybe it's you. It's not me, but maybe it's you, and that's fine. Same thing with like Zeos, same thing with Josh, same thing with DMS. Like, I don't think this is a zero-sum game or a race to the bottom or anything like that. Like, I think there are some folks who are doing things that I think are damaging, and there are some things that have been expressed by people that I think are just wrong. But it's not about like, it's okay to be wrong. It's more about like what you do afterwards that I think is important, or like if you change your mind about something. But that's also why I don't think like people should just, I've talked about it before, but there's like people who just follow one opinion, and they think this one opinion is like the perfect word about everything to do with audio and headphones. And I think that's a super myopic way of looking at it. Like, I think we need to be a little bit more like treating things, even like the things that I say, they're just my perspective. The things that Crin says, this goes back to a question that somebody else asked about like treating things as if they're objective. Well, if you're reviewing something and you have an opinion about something, you think that's true, you're going to report it that way. And I don't like the idea, or when people say, "Oh, everything is just relative." Like, okay, there's subjectivity in this stuff to a certain extent, because I have no idea how you want your music to sound, but there are certain facts about human beings and hearing, that are worth taking into consideration. That like have nothing to do with how you might prefer to listen to stuff, but at the same time are, if we're talking about like, again, a wide range of people, it's worth taking that stuff into account. Like subjectivity is subjectivity in this hobby is like a thing to a point. I think that's how I would frame that. What is Headphone? There is no purely objective review, but we have a good idea whether the average consumer would enjoy a specific frequency response. There it is. People ask me, like, should everything be tuned to the same target? Or they think, it's not that they ask me, they think that I'm saying that everything should be tuned to the same target when I use a version of the Harman target in my reviews. But that's kind of, like, I don't think everything should be tuned to the Harman target. If anything, the Kiwi Ears Orchestra really strongly demonstrates that you can have multiple different tunings that sound really good. This is, again, we have a good idea whether or not the average consumer would enjoy a specific frequency response. What Metal just said, that's exactly it. And as long as you're kind of like within that range, you can have various different flavors one way or another. Average consumer, who is that? An average consumer wouldn't buy multi-$1,000 headphones to start with. Yeah, but you could put that at any price. It doesn't matter what the price is. Like, this is the thing. I don't mind that. I'm trying to think of an example. The Hi-Fi Man Aria, right there, is a great example, because it's not that headphone doesn't perfectly match that target. It's actually a little brighter there than the target. But the nice thing about the Aria is that it's harmonically balanced, even though it's a little brighter in the treble. So in the mid treble and stuff like that. So the harmonics are all balanced out with one another. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of that sort of like the typical sort of hi-fi man dip in the mids, but it's like right at around like 1.5 or 2K. But for the areas that our ears are very sensitive to, the aria is harmonically balanced, and it doesn't match the target, but that doesn't really matter. The description would be, oh, it's a little brighter in the treble, but at the same time, not brighter in any fatiguing or harmonically weird way. Really, I think like there are two things that are important to two things to consider when looking at frequency response and how headphones adhere or deviate from a target. One of them is the overall kind of like zoomed out tonal balance. Is it reasonably close to something that most people prefer? Yes or no? Okay. And I say reasonably close, like it doesn't have to perfectly match, but like, yeah, reasonably close. The second thing to consider is, are there any significant harmonic imbalances? And that's like, I want to say that's like just as important, because you can have a headphone that generally adheres to the target but still has harmonic imbalances, and you can have a headphone that doesn't adhere but also is harmonically balanced. So I think like that's also like a piece of the analysis that's missing. At the very least, the one nice thing about the Harman target is, at least above 1K, is that you are going to get balanced harmonics there. So that overall tonal balance is gonna give you like no one particular harmonic is going to be emphasized over the rest, if it's kind of close to that. But I also still like I strongly believe that so headphones should be, this is something that Mad mentioned, and I agree with this. Headphones should be evaluated against some version of the Harman target, but they shouldn't necessarily be tuned to the Harman target, because there are places where it should deviate. And the reason for this is because the Harman target, or any of these targets, well, not all of them, but that one specifically, all versions of the Harman target, they are highly smooth and highly average targets. So they are like 1/3 octave smoothing or something like that. And when you measure frequency response, you're never smoothing it to that degree. Like if you did smooth it to that degree, you would, like for good headphones, you would get basically the same result. So there are places like, for example, at 9K where things should deviate a little bit from the Harman target. And you want to be able to get a slightly more fine-grained look at the headphone's frequency response. But, just recognize that the Harman target is highly, highly smoothed. I almost think what would be more interesting there is, what would you get if you had the same smoothing for that frequency response, like an eighth, one, or no, it's a 12th, I think, not an eighth. It's Control 8 on the keyboard. it's a 12th, 1/12 octave smoothing, or Control Shift 8 or something like that. Yeah, 1/24 or 1/12 octave smoothing. What would that Harman target look like there above 1K? I wonder. So it'd be interesting. I feel like I've missed a lot. What do you guys think about the Mammoth and Holocene from Campfire Audio? I haven't heard them yet. I think Theo has them right now. But I'm not super encouraged. I mean, I think this is one example where, if they... I think they could do a better job of paying a little bit more closer attention to how things should measure and how things should sound. The one thing I'm going to give them credit for, though, the Campfire Audio, that is that they do typically have pretty good technical performance. Like they do typically, again, I haven't heard those ones, but like, the Andromeda 2020 and, the Solaris and stuff like that. Like I find them to be reasonably competitive for their, detail and stuff like that. But I think, they came out with the Andromeda and the Solaris, and those two, like the Andromeda specifically, was the thing that it was sort of lightning in a bottle, I guess. And all the other stuff that they've made hasn't really been, hasn't really gotten the same kind of excitement behind it. So I think what they should do, I mean, I just, even as an experiment, I'd be curious what their, how it would look for them if they said, okay, yeah, we're going to make something that actually measures well, and how the IEM world would sort of respond to that. That's what I would wonder, because I'm sure they can do it. You know, it's yeah, especially with like multi BA stuff. Like, I want them to make a hybrid and just tune it well, and just see what happens. Be curious. Having a lot of money doesn't indicate having an unusual sound preference. That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, like it's an important question for like audiophiles who are deliberately trying to add a certain character or flavor to something and saying, "Oh, I don't want my stuff to sound neutral." Okay, that's fine. That's one thing. I'm sympathetic to that. But if you're going to tell me that a frequency response, like, I'm just trying to think of something, the DCA Aeon Open, the Aeon 2 Open, if you're going to tell me that frequency response, no, even better, Campfire Cascade, if you're going to tell me that is like okay sounding, I got real problems with that. And some people like it because they're like super bass heads, but it's not even about the bass. Like, the bass is just ridiculous there, but like, there are harmonic imbalances in the treble that are like just not right for the human ear. Like, they're not right for human hearing. I'm trying to think of other examples. Oh yeah, I recently was evaluating the Bayer Dynamic T5P. Good lord, is that thing ever harmonically imbalanced? It's not the worst. Like, I think there's stuff that's worse than that. The Gold Planar GL2000 is another example of just harmonic imbalances everywhere in the upper mids and treble, leading to that sort of compressed and congested kind of sound. It's again, there's certain facts about human hearing and the ear, the physical ear, that it might differ from human to human, but there are general similarities there. Like, we have these features, you know, the shape might differ, but those features exist. So you might as well, you know, try and get somewhere close to what the brain expects to hear for that. And in my opinion, and this is, again, like, feel free to disagree, but like, in my opinion, above 1K, it's basically been figured out. And you don't have to match it perfectly, but getting some sort of, you know, ear gain there that's reasonably of a similar, you know, shape, if you smooth it to the same degree as the target, that's what you want. Below 1K, you know, do whatever you want. Like, that's all preference. And like, to a certain extent, I guess you could say the same thing for the upper treble as well, but I think a lot of that's going to depend on age of the listener. But yeah, below 1K or below 900 hertz or wherever, basically like the lower mids and bass, lower mids and bass, where the ear isn't having a significant effect on those frequencies, then you can kind of like you can do kind of whatever you want there. And it's worth playing around with EQ to see what you do want. I would argue that what you do want is probably something close to what, you know, the 2013 Harman shelf asks for, but maybe you don't. Maybe you want more bass, maybe you want less. But a lot of that is also like, when people are very like militant about, you know, oh, it's the Harman target's just like an average of a certain number of people and it's only like 65% of them or whatever. That's because they have a headphone that doesn't match the Harman target, and they want to, like, I guess, justify the purchase. Not in all cases, but in some cases, that's you know, like, oh, it deviates and therefore somebody thinks that it's bad. I'm not the person who's always going to say that, but like, people are going to be like criticizing it for whatever reason, and then immediately the conclusion is, oh no, the target's wrong, when the reality is that person's only really heard that one headphone, and they haven't had the breadth of experience with a wide variety of other stuff. They've only heard the one headphone, and they might like it genuinely, but they might like something else more that's a little closer to it. That's just, they haven't had that experience yet. Reviewers like Resolve and I will continue to believe, based on personal experience, that there's more to high end than just graphs we have so far. Oh, interesting market segment. Yeah. But you even see that with someone did an analysis of Crin's like the technical performance on Crin's list, and did analysis between like how well things scored versus price. And it was funny because it typically scaled upwards with price, like to a certain degree. Like there were obviously exceptions, but at least they think they did it up to like 1K or something like that. Pretty interesting to see that. And I think that's also true. One thing I've really noticed with this stuff as well is that like again, there are exceptions, but to a certain degree, manufacturers are, like I say, manufacturers, engineers, or whoever is like deciding how much something should cost. They generally get it reasonably close when it comes to technical performance. Like again, below 1K, they get it reasonably close there, or let's say below 2K. But what they have less of a good sense of, like for the competitive landscape, is how something performs tonally, like how the tonal balance is. And so I think that it makes a little bit more sense why those two would be a little bit more congruent, like the on Crin's list, like the technical performance with price. But you obviously have examples like the Empyrean's counter example, the Ultrasone edition. I can't remember what edition 10 or 15. No, yeah, I can't remember what that one was, but that's definitely a counter example. You do see some, like especially in the upper high end, because what's happening there is they've done something else that's like a reason for people to buy it. Like for example, in the Empyrean, it's the build quality and the comfort, and maybe the tuning there as well. That people really like that kind of warm, thick, soupy. I don't know how else to describe it. But that's not as, like, it doesn't fit within that competitive landscape at that price as significantly. But I think generally, like, I don't know, like what's an example? Like a Focal Clear is more detailed than stuff like a DT 1990 at $500, or a more than a Sundara, or it's got better macro contrasts than a Sundara. An HD 100S is better at soundstage than, well, most things, but you know what I mean? Like, so it goes up in price because of a certain technical character, less so better frequency response, because to a certain extent, the frequency response has been figured out already at like $350, or trying to think of, like K371 is basically figured out frequency response, and that's only like, that's under $200. So it kind of makes sense that it wouldn't perfectly correlate there, and you have to find something else. Let's see. I mean, I saw a question there about like genre. I really think, as much as like I agree with what Fang Bien said like over a year ago in that interview, I agree with what he said about you can't base your tuning preference strictly on genre, because even within genres you have a wide range of recording styles that are gonna, or a wide range of mixing and mastering styles that are going to end up having things sound quite different. But I think you can still make certain judgments about tunings based on instrument type. Like for example, electric guitars, if something is a little too shouty, they're a little too hot in the upper mids, like has too much ear gain, electric guitars are going to be a little bit biting and fatiguing there. So that's why I like to say, like, okay, for metal music or rock music, you'd probably want it to be a little more relaxed there, and you'd probably want more bass too. Whereas for jazz and classical and acoustic and piano music and stuff like that, piano music, you almost want more, like a more pronounced elevation there. Or something like the Hi-Fi Man aria is fantastic for those genres. It's a little brighter there, and I imagine it's not going to be as good for rock and metal. Should I think of something else? The HD100S, I find that to be quite shrill with more aggressive music. It's totally innocuous for classical and acoustic. So there is an element of genre there that's not based around genre necessarily, but sufficiently, insofar as there are certain instrument tones that like certain instruments can sound a certain way based on a certain tuning. Would you consider doing a headphone tier list? Yeah, I talked about that earlier. Yeah, I need to do that. I just don't have a platform for it. Like I can't, like I need to host it somewhere. That's the thing. I might just do it on the forum. Let's see. Promoting snake oil is not just wrong. That's why I think Darko is different from the rest of the reviewers. Man, he did a video on those like door stopper things and putting them on DACs. I don't know how anybody could watch that and go, yeah, that's a good idea. Like, come on, like people can barely tell the difference. You can't reliably tell the difference among DACs, anyways. Like in blind tests, I have a real hard time imagining you'd be able to hear any benefit from something like that. I just think he's doing something a little different. I think he's doing something that's not, he's not trying to do what the rest of us are doing. Do you still play StarCraft 2? I don't anymore. I haven't had time, but I need to actually get back into doing it because I need to review this keyboard. Oops. That's the drop control with so this one has like I think it's got MT3 profile for the keycaps, which are not that great for that, but they are really nice for typing. And this is with the Holy Pandas, so I want to kind of evaluate the Holy Pandas for that kind of stuff. So I need to get back into it, but I haven't played in a long time. Ever since they stopped kind of supporting the game, it's felt kind of weird to. Plus, I don't have time anymore. Like, it sucks because like I used to be at a top 100 GM level, and when you take a break for like as long as I have, like a year at least, it's or maybe even longer, like 2 years, and trying to come back into it, not only do you have to relearn, like you have to learn all the new whatever the meta is, but then you also have to, like, your I guess mechanical ability sort of like degraded over that amount of time, so you have to get back into practice in that sense because it's so competitive. And when you basically you end up just losing a lot for the first like while before, and it feels really bad. It feels terrible because you're like, oh, I used to be able to compete with these guys, and now I'm getting dunked on by them. And so like I'm sure my MMR's dropped down. Like I used to be like 5,600, and then I'm pretty sure I dropped down to like 5,000 now. So let's see. Imagine people not allowing others to enjoy headphones they enjoy. It is sad, but it does happen. There's nothing wrong with liking something. Yeah, that's the other thing. Like, with all reviewers, like, it's just expressing how we feel about them. Like, and this is why I don't like to do just, oh, here, adherence to a target, deviation from it. I don't like to do that stuff because it's like you have to show that stuff because it's important information, but like to just index for that, I think is like, it's missing a little bit. But then also, yeah, like it's important, it's important to recognize that like if you like something, then screw what everybody else says. Like, I know there's a lot of people who like the Empyrean, and I didn't really like the Empyrean that much. Like I liked it, but I didn't love it. And it's like one of those things where it's like if you don't love it, then suddenly people think you hate it. Man. Anyways, because I didn't love it, I got a lot of hate for that. And but the reality there is like, screw what I say about it. If you like it, then enjoy it. Live your life and be happy. Oh yeah, I see. The only reason This is Metal saying the only reason I was critical of the MP was some of the other high-end planers around that price, which to me seemed to do subjective things like detail and slam better. Yeah, absolutely. That's really what it's at. Like that, I actually think the tuning for the Empyrean is pretty good. Apart from, yeah, I mean, again, I didn't like the upper treble and I didn't like the kind of bloat, but I can see why people would like that, you know. But yeah, there's definitely a concept of when I say this sounds expensive at a show based on perceived detail on stage. This sounds expensive. Yeah, exactly. I saw another question in there, but I missed it. Opinion on IEM not needing a 3K peak to sound balanced slash neutral, something like U12T. So they do still have ear gain though. That's the thing. They don't have a. It's not like if you look at like the Moondrop stuff, like the S8's really strong, you know, of a ear gain region there. I think that's too much. The S8 I think is too much there. But yeah, like the U12T and the SA6 both have ear gain, but they're not like massively pronounced for that. And just because they're not as smooth as something like the S8, you know, that's actually okay. I think really the key thing is that it has to have some ear gain. It doesn't have to perfectly match it. It's nice if it gets the harmonic balance right there between upper mids and lower treble, but it doesn't have to perfectly have the same amount. It doesn't have to have the same, you know, exact same shape. It can be a little relaxed there, and that's totally fine. Again, a lot of it, I think that's really where the genre thing comes in. Let's see. Couple more questions, guys, and then I'm gonna head out because I've been going for 2 hours now. Top 100. Yeah. Well, it's I was ranked 35 in North America at one point, but I this is the thing is when you get to that level, the ladder stuff doesn't. Honestly, 5600 is not that. Like I wasn't on the level of like the pros. Like I could take a game off. I've took 2 games off of Puck. You know, I could hang with them, but in a tournament environment, I wouldn't get very far. So ladder is different from tournament environments. Basically, like on ladder, the best players, like you can in theory do well on ladder just by cheesing if you wanted to, but the people who are really good are able to just, you know, play standard and then you know, they just outplay you, you know, every time. So even if you have this one particular thing that can take one game off of somebody, that's not going to work the second time because they'll know. They'll be like, oh yeah, I can. The tell is there. What EQ do you currently have set for your LCD XC? I mainly just drop like around 5K. Let me just double check here. Yeah, I mainly drop around like 5.3K. I drop the upper treble, and then I also boost the sub bass. I like Shit Audio's response as to why they don't support MQA. Yeah, I you know, Shit's marketing is the best. I love that kind of stuff because it's a way more healthy relationship to information. Like, you know, regardless of how you feel about their products, that is so much better than, you know, this overly, you know, flowery stuff. At least in my opinion, I'd rather like get like more just like a straightforward, you know, description or answer. You know, actually, I got to say, the other marketing material that I really like and approach that I really like is what Final Audio does. They just publish all of their, you know, engineering stuff. They're just like, yeah, this is what we do. So that's pretty cool. Dunu as well, fantastic. What do I think of R2R DACs? I need to try more of them. Yeah, I'd be happy to get into that kind of stuff because, you know, if you think about the stuff that measures well, it's typically the off-the-shelf stuff. Can you rank equipment in priority? I assume headphones, amp, music quality. Headphones, well, yeah, I mean, assuming you had like you're not doing like 192K files and stuff like that, like I mean, even that, like, yeah, headphones, then amps, then DACs. I don't know, that's like, what else do you I mean, to a certain extent, I even think like, as long as you're good enough on the amp and DAC front, like the good enough stuff, just the stuff that isn't good enough is like this, right? Or like the, the FIO E10K or some of that stuff that's like just really tiny little, like, it's, yeah, that stuff, it's very obvious the difference. Like you can easily get that on a blind test, that's the one that doesn't sound right, and so all these other ones sound totally fine. Once you're at that point, what doesn't matter whether it's a Magna 3 Heresy or an Atom or an L30, well, as long as it's not the Explodey L30, or this topping EX5 or whatever that's called, or yeah, or a THX amp or anything like that. That's your good enough stuff. Modius Magnius stack, right? That's your good enough stuff. And then it doesn't matter, but among those, right? Like you can go from, to any of them, and it's really just not that much difference. Then, yeah, okay, the Rebel amp is better than them. The Rebel amp, I think it's better than the A90. Uh, you know, you can get into some of that stuff. The IHA6 for planars, sure. But even still, that's not a huge difference over the good enough stuff. Then you get into the ridiculously expensive stuff, and then suddenly the differences become much more significant. Like, I'm talking like, $2,000 plus stuff. So all of the stuff that's like in that range of like under $500, it really isn't that big of a difference. And people stress about that. They go, oh, do I get the, what's better, the, Magna 3 Heresy or the topping L30 or the, and it's like, it doesn't matter. That stuff is like, just, and people will side grade, that's the thing, is they'll be like, oh no, I'm gonna get this one because some reviewer said that this measures better than that one, and then they'll, or that this one sounds sterile and I didn't like that, so whatever. But it's all basically the same once it's in the good enough territory. So that's why my answer is always just like, just don't stress about that stuff. Like, get yourself something that's good enough, and maybe it's not as good as a Rebel amp, sure, but I still think like, just save the money and spend that on headphones, and don't get into the sunk cost fallacy of constantly trying to upgrade your source gear, when really what you should be doing is just putting all of that money into higher end headphones and just keeping the good enough stuff until you're ready to say, this is the headphone that I'm so ready, like I'm done with this thing, I'm not going to look at the internet again, I've got my end game headphone. And then look into what you think is going to pair best with that, because they do make a difference. Just it's so minor compared to the massive difference that changing headphones does. So I know this isn't like a typical, this is maybe a little bit counterintuitive to like what the typical like audiophile sentiment is, but like, I bet that most people in a blind test, they wouldn't be able to get the difference when they're comparing these things. Like, they wouldn't be able to identify one solid state source from another. um but which is a little bit, it's a bit telling, because like, I want to say like at least 60% of the questions that I get are based on sources, when you know and yeah, it's, I really think it's like, it's part of like the psychology of buying things that like is the reason people get super into this kind of stuff, and they keep asking about that. Burst and Soloist X3X, people keep talking about that one. I got to try that one. And this is actually the thing, like, I'm going to be doing a video on the EX5 here, the topping X Shenzhen audio thing, and the basically that's going to go something like this. At this price, this thing is absolutely worth it. It's a solid thing. But if you're trying to get something that's going to change the headphones or do something to the sound, then yeah, you're gonna want to go with something that is more high end. You're gonna, so this does literally nothing. It just is just volume. And people keep trying to think about, how can I, change the sound, or improve the sound. I'll tell you how you can do that. Use EQ. That's how you can change the sound. It's not, going from that to a micro black label isn't going to make you enjoy your headphones significant. I mean, unless you use the little, bass boost function, but it's not going to be a massive difference. And to the point where, like, I don't think people would really be able to get it in a blind test. I think there is a difference. I just don't think it's a meaningful one. I don't think it's one that really matters when you talk about the massive price difference that we're talking about. Like, it's, you could spend $600 on an amp, or you could spend $200 on an amp, $300 on an amp, and put the rest of the money into just higher end headphones. Tile really established the baseline the work that Kryn, Resolve, and Metal do, and a very good counter to the whole Headphone snake oil infused campaign. I actually don't have anything really that, like, I don't spend time on Headphone. I don't get into the threads because I think there's a lot of just like that sort of like black and white thinking. There's a lot of like, if you don't love it, if it's not the best thing ever, then suddenly it's terrible. And then there's when that happens, people are completely unable to like get the nuance there, and then they'll just inevitably goalpost shift on you. And I really don't like the goalpost shifting. So I don't really participate there. But the one thing that I will say is that I do genuinely believe that even when people are convincing themselves that cables make a difference, that like on Headphone and various different threads, I do genuinely believe that they are hearing those differences, but only as a function of paying attention more to that stuff. So we can call it snake oil, but I agree with this is a point that Matt Economist made. We had him on our live stream. I agree with the sentiment that who's to say they aren't actually hearing those things because of how powerful the psychoacoustic things are. Like, when you're paying more attention to details, technically you're actually getting more out of it as a result of someone telling you that this particular amplifier does this thing. This goes back to the narrative question we were talking about earlier. So if there is a psychoacoustic effect that's drawing your attention to certain aspects of the music, who's to say you aren't actually hearing that stuff? So I don't have that much of an issue with what people are doing on Headphone. I think there's a collective inertia of madness that results from it sometimes. Like, for example, these romantic descriptions about the differences that cables make, or even like amps and DACs and whatever else. I think there is that inertia of madness, but at the same time, I don't want to discount people's experiences. I actually think that people are doing their best to genuinely report their experiences, and that's important. What EQ program do I use? I use Equalizer APO with PCUI. Some headphones do change on tubes. Oh, yeah. So don't get me wrong. Tubes are a totally different... I'm talking strictly solid state stuff here. Like, and even the solid state stuff does change, but it doesn't really matter until you get into the really high end stuff. That's been my experience so far. Like, if you're spending $2,000 plus, then those differences make, well, not necessarily, but can make a much more significant difference than the stuff that's like, under $500 typically, or even under $1,000 generally. But it's not to say they don't make a difference, just like the difference is suddenly a bit more meaningful. But with tube amps, yeah, like that stuff is a massive difference. That stuff, like, that throws the question about like the value of the which component is the more valuable out the window a little bit. It turns it on its head, because I can see a scenario where you could use like an Amps and Sound Kenzie or Forge or Mogwai or something like that, and you could run an HD600 off of that, and that could be your end game. Your end game is more based around the amplifier than the headphones, but I would only really recommend that for tube amps, or the like. And when I say that, like, I mean high end, like that stuff's like $2,000. No, I wouldn't do that. I'm just saying like I wouldn't say 600, but people love that headphone, right? So if you love a headphone and you're like, I want that to be that type of sound to be my end game kind of sound, and I'm never going to EQ, then sure, get that crazy high end tube amp, and that will make a pretty significant difference. It's sad that HE6 SEV2 isn't 650 anymore. Wasn't it just like recently? Oh, last week. Yeah, yeah. Favorite headphone with EQ under 1K is probably LCD2F. Yeah. I need to spend more time with the Forge amp because I only got a chance to listen to Utopia off of it, and the H200S, but I want to try other stuff with it. But Taryn took it back. I sent back every quote-unquote upgrade on solid-state amps from my 789 until I bought a Woo Audio Wah 22 to my ear most massive. Yeah, yeah. Like, when you get into that crazy high-end stuff, they're doing things with, I don't know, call it non-linearities, call it whatever you want. They're doing stuff with those amp designs that are meaningfully different, you know? Will Resolve ever do any speaker reviews? Yeah, I have some Head Audio studio monitors that I'm reviewing right now. I probably won't review the ADI2 because Grover's reviewing it. So, but we will have a video on the channel soon, yeah. Yeah, you're talking about the measurement systems, yeah. It's it's pretty confusing. There is something as well, like, you know, Tile kind of put a lot of this stuff into motion, and he deserves all the credit for that, for really trying to, you know, help people out with this stuff. But there was also a lot of stuff that was experimental that I think now we're at a point where we can go, okay, you know, that this was valuable, this wasn't valuable, and you can move forward, and yeah, we don't need to pay attention to certain things. But also the measurement equipment has evolved as well. So I think what we're getting now from, I mean, apart from even like the new B&K stuff, like even the 701 stuff has, like the Gross stuff has also evolved. So I think we're at a point now where the data we're collecting is better than what Tile put together back then, just because we have, you know, more modern anthropometric ears, and yeah, and of course with the 5128, like that's more advanced. I don't find the Utopia to be sibilant at all. Not the one that I evaluated. You know, again, there's a narrative that the Utopia is bright, and it's not a bright headphone. Like I showed the measurements, like off of a low output impedance source. It's not a bright headphone. Like there are certain peaks in the treble that do kind of shift the timbre a little bit, but it's not. It's not. It's actually, honestly, like for the most of it, it's even a little less than the target there. So. Best open back under $1,000, Alex or LCD2C, LCD2F. Oh, Metal just said it. Yeah, he knows. No, I didn't think the LCD2 Classic was particularly good. Like, I have one in the office right now, and it's not as competitive. Is HE6 SE a solid upgrade to Sundara? HE6 SEV2 at $650 from the Adorama deal is definitely worth it. But the V1, the pads on are like, you got to switch the pads out to like the Sandara 2020 pads to make it tolerable, and then even then I'd EQ it and I'd switch out the headband because man, the headband on the V1 is just, it's the same headband, but it's like they use the old pads, and so the clamp is extreme and it's heavy, and no. But the V2, they switched out to the newer headband, which is way more comfortable, and I think they changed the pads as well. I might be wrong about the pads, but the tuning was way better on the V2. So I didn't review it. I don't know if I can. I think it's terrible. I should review it and say it's terrible. Like, okay, like let's talk about this thing. It's kind of cute, if you like this little wheel thingy here, but this is like the soundstage on this is so, it's almost mono. Like it just feels like everything is like, it'll get loud enough, but this just feels like everything is just not being powered correctly. This is an example of an amplifier or a DAC amp combo that is not good enough in my opinion. And so I can't, I mean, it does lots of functions and stuff like that, but yeah, it's not something that I can really recommend. The DAC might be fine. I think it's like a 90, what is it, AKM? 4490 or something like that, or maybe a little low, I'm not sure, but that as a DAC amp combo, no. Can a Pro ICANN drive an HE6 properly? Yeah, of course. You can drive an HE6 SE, like a regular an old school HE6, off of actually decently wide range of stuff these days. It used to be that there wasn't much out there that could power it, but oh, I need to get a new LCD2F. But I remember hearing the grain on the LCD2 Classic. Like I remember, even just like I was comparing it to like other headphones around that price, and I remember thinking it's not that impressive. Like I'm just thinking like Ananda and some of the other stuff there. Like I'd almost even take a Sundara over an LCD2 Classic. Um, maybe not. Maybe not. I have to do that again because I actually have both in the studio right now. Resolves reaction whenever someone mentions VRM headphones. No, there are reasons why. Like no. For dynamic headphones, do you think bigger size driver generally sounds better than the smaller ones? Nope. No, people look all the time for things that predict this stuff. Really, like frequency response is going to predict that. But for all the technical performance, no. So actually next week I don't know when the videos will come out, probably a week after, but at some point in the next couple of months, we're going to be doing some educational videos on how planar magnetic headphones work and how they're tuned and why they're tuned the way that they are, and what's different about planar magnetic headphones from dynamic driver headphones. And one of the things that we want to do is we want to try to answer the question of what would happen if you made a planar magnetic headphone like a dynamic driver headphone and made a dynamic driver headphone like a planar magnetic headphone, and what would the results be. And there's a bit of like an obvious like answer, but this is more just going to demonstrate that. But so for example, the key thing with planars is that you typically don't see a bass boost on them. You see kind of more like a linear bass go, like bass without the bass boost or bass shelf like you'd have with something like, or sorry, like where is it here, like these ones, right? Uh, and But what happens there is a lot of that is based around the planar driver's resonance frequency and where the resonance frequency is. And on some, it's really quite high, like the DCA headphones, it's really quite high, and so they get around that by having like pads that are adhesively affixed to the housing, and then that it depends on a seal to get the bass response, and then also they kind of just like cut the rest of the tuning there, like the mids and treble to more so mids, to try and to give a relative sense of extra bass, because the resonance frequency for those headphones is like 500 hertz, but on something like an HE6 the resonance frequency is at like 30 hertz. The Arias and the Anandas, they all have really good bass extension there, and because the resonance frequency is also really low on those. And when I say resonance frequency, that's sometimes written as like F with subscript S. That means that in free air, you would actually see a boost somewhere in the bass. So that tells us a number of things, but it also means that the only way that we would potentially be able to naturally achieve a bass shelf in a planar magnetic headphone, the way that we might get with a dynamic driver headphone, I keep forgetting these are planars, is by adding an intentional leak between the pads and or somewhere adding an intentional leak to try and get some of that resonance frequency in the frequency response. And you can do this with a certain, like as an example, the HE6 SE, well, actually, and the original HE6 as well, with the default grill that actually traps air behind the diaphragm and adds, I'm told at least, that it adds mass to the diaphragm. And this makes it so that you get the bass boost if you break the seal, but at the same time, it kind of lowers the peak, the Q value of the resonance frequency, so that it's almost like a smoother, more gradual bass shelf rather than the really strong, pronounced resonance frequency that you would get if it were in free air. And so what's interesting is when people were taking off the so it almost has sort of like a damping effect there. And so when people were taking off the grill there and then introducing a deliberate leak, they were actually getting a more pronounced and narrower Q value for the peak. But I think one of the reasons why they wanted to do that was because it did, potentially boost the bass in their environment. Like when people who are wearing glasses and stuff like that, they'd actually perceptively notice a difference in the sub bass when they did that. But if it were sealing perfectly, you probably wouldn't notice much difference. But I don't know, that's neither here nor there. It's just something interesting to note. But typically, like with a lot of planars that are out there, like on some of these Odysseys, actually, surprisingly, the resonance frequency is a little bit higher. And so they kind of do depend on a seal a little bit more. I'm pointing over at some of the Odyssey headphones. The Sundaras is also a little higher. Like it's somewhere, I should double check, somewhere between 100 and 200 hertz, I think. And I want to say the same for the Odysseys, but the Arias is quite low because it's physically larger cup. Sorry, this is all going back to the question about the size of drivers, and I'm on planars now, which is a totally different tangent. But it's interesting to see how these different parameters work, and I think in planars, the point I was trying to make was that I think that's a more significant parameter, the physical size in planars, because of that, and just the way that the planar tuning works and how it sort of takes coupling into consideration. And when you're dealing with smaller, like you're not going to get your resonance frequency is going to be way higher if you don't have the moving mass, which is achieved by larger size. So there's a number of different ways of achieving larger size for planar transducers, or lower resonance frequency for planar transducers. One of them would be increasing the size. One of them would be increasing the mass. At least so I'm told. And some of the testing that I've done, like myself, has kind of shown this as well, where when you break the seal on the large large transducers like the Aria and the Ananda and the to a certain extent the Sundara as well, you actually get a fairly low resonance frequency there. And on the smaller drivers like the Odyssey ones, it's a little higher, and on the even smaller ones like the DCA ones, it's even higher. So that seems to be fairly consistent there. Now, what I think is interesting is what contributes to punch and slam. I know I'm going on a tangent here, but what contributes to punch and slam in a planar? And we can figure this out from a like, you can look at like, okay, this headphone uses these parameters and these materials, and you can say that headphone's really punchy, like I'm thinking of the HE6, but it doesn't seem to be correlated with any measured result. But one of the things that is being that I'm currently testing with in-ear microphones is whether or not that perception is due to the way that it couples to the side of my head, and if that is incurring some sort of unique behavior for the resonance frequency of the driver. And in situations where the resonance frequency is low, that coupling, that unique coupling, is contributing to an extra sense of punch. And where the resonance frequency is high, it's actually a lack of bass in the situation where it's on my head, right? So I think, so that's what I'm investigating. But right now I've found like way too many counterexamples. Like the Aria and the Ananda are both counterexamples to that, because they have low resonance frequencies and they don't have much or as much punch and slam as even the Sundara. And the Sundara is its resonance frequency is higher. Same with the Odyssey stuff. So kind of interesting, I think. But anyway, so that we'll do that like in the next couple of weeks, and we'll have some videos kind of explaining how these planars work and how they're tuned and various different parameters, because I think we do focus on certain parameters and we completely ignore others in the media. So okay, one more question here, guys. One more. Yeah, I turned down the volume because there was, I think my girlfriend was had a phone call, so I didn't want that to come through. It's should be fine. Oh yeah, it's pretty low now. I want to, if I want to measure and review AB1266 Phi TC, but I want it to be a current one, because otherwise people are going to goalpost shift on me and say, oh, that's not the current one. What was the point of that? And I don't want to be like, one of those people who reviews something that is like, not what not what's representative of what people will be buying. I think that's a requirement. Like, I mean, unless you're deliberately trying to cover something that's older because, it's like if something's discontinued, for example, I got no issue with that. But specifically something like, what would be the point of reviewing a pre-2020 Sundara now, for example? I wouldn't do that. So it's got to be representative of what people are potentially buying. Yeah, LCD-X 2021 still needs EQ. Well, still benefits from EQ, especially in the sub bass. Like, just boost that stuff up. Like, I still like, as much as they've gotten a lot better, Odyssey's gotten a lot better with their tunings. I still think if you're gonna get into Odyssey, you might as well get into EQ. Like, I think that's those two go hand in hand. All right, guys, that's going to do it for this live stream. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. I know we got into a little bit of a tangent and a rant there on sources, but and probably alienated most folks who are here specifically asking about source equipment. But yeah, we'll do another one of these live streams next week, and yeah, we'll have more reviews coming throughout the week. The U6T review is going to be out or impressions, I guess, is going to be out fairly soon. But in the meantime, guys, if you haven't seen it yet, you can check out Precog's review of the variations up on headphones.com, the Moondrop variations, which if you're interested in IEMs, that's definitely one to check out. I haven't heard it, but I'm hopeful to hear it. But yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for tuning in.